Thank you guys for attending this session. One of the main reasons that I decided to do my project on this is because I have been in an ARC committee through various roles. I've been a parent, I had a child with speech when they were preschool and kindergarten, first grade. I've been a regular education teacher, a special education teacher, and now a school counselor where I am chairing the meeting. So I thought it was just important to see how we can make the ARC experience most relevant for parents and just all members to get the most amount of participation so we can do what we can for our students. Okay, so the ARC chairperson defined. State law says that it is the individual education program, the membership, a representative of the local education agency that's qualified to provide or supervise the provision of specially designed instruction to meet the needs of children with disabilities and is knowledgeable about the general curriculum and the availability of the resources that the LEA can provide. The LEA representative must know what specially designed instruction looks like and ensures that free appropriate public education is provided through measurable goals and progress data. The LEA representative has knowledge of the district's available resources. So they would know if a service or resource could be provided to a student, if that would be a possibility. As an LEA representative, decisions cannot be made due to financial or professional convenience. They have to be made in the best interest of the child. One thing I will say about this is, where I had previous experience as a special education teacher, being an ARC chairperson, I'm not sure I could have really been a very good chair without that previous knowledge. Mm-hmm. I feel like that because I had a background, I kind of knew a little bit about it, and I could understand that somebody new in administration had been maybe a regular education teacher that just slides into an administrative role would have difficulty knowing those things. Procedural safeguards. Beginning of every meeting, the ARC chairperson has to provide those procedural safeguards to parents. That's a copy of the safeguard notice in their native language at the appropriate times each year. They will receive a full explanation of the procedural safeguards as well. Those appropriate times include if a parent has a complaint, if it is a student misconduct meeting, if the meeting is due to a parent request, and then of course we have to go over those procedural safeguards at every annual review meeting. I'm not going to take the time to read the law, but that's basically what it says in a nutshell.
I'm going to ask you a question
yes,
here. Do you see in your district different ways of documenting that in the conference summary minutes? Is there some, like for example, sometimes you may see something about waiving parent rights. Do you have any comment about that, or?
We always go over the parent rights. Right. I always summarize them. We always ask them if they want us to read the entire document to them and explain it. Most of the time they say no, but I always summarize the rights and we document that in the conference summary.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
And I always, if they don't, we give them a copy of the big one, and I also have a small handout that basically has their rights summarized. It's one sheet. I give that to the parent, and I read over that, and then.
And that clear understanding. So
yes.
Yes, is the
and the smaller document is kind of written in an easier language to understand. A lot of times parents don't understand those educational jargon words or the words, the KAR wording. So that kind of breaks it down in easy to understand language. The LEA representative or ARC chairperson determines student representative, the purpose of the meeting, and I've got a little arrow that says stick to the purpose. So if our meeting is over a behavior issue, if that's or a parent request for testing, we need to stick to that purpose and not drag in several other things. Or if we're having a meeting that's an annual review, and we need to stick to that topic. Or if it's getting consent, stick to the purpose of your meeting. The LEA rep decides the time, place, and date of the ARC. If a representative from an outside agency for post-secondary transition purposes should be invited, Also, like if a child is coming from First Steps into preschool, they must have an invitation 7 days prior to the meeting in writing. When based on the student's age grade, invite the student, that's age 14, is it? Mm-hmm. Yeah, age 14 students are invited. And then the LEA representative is either the conference summary recorder or they determine who is going to be the conference summary recorder. Parental consent must be given before an outside agency is invited to the meeting. The meeting notice must provide that additional time that is needed for consent to be obtained prior to inviting an outside agency. If you have a question on what's an outside agency, if they do not receive a paycheck from your district, they're considered an outside agency. We have KRCC in our building. I know probably a lot of you do. They're close in our region. If they'd like to be part of the meeting or the parent wants them invited, we got to make sure we get that on the invitation 7 days in advance.
And you know, lots of times we think about just transition for outside agencies, but we're seeing an increasing number of mental health issues and things of that nature in schools. So we have to be really careful about, you know, are we going in, because that kind of information really goes a long way sometimes in you know, educating a child through academics and functionality and behavior. So we want to keep that as a memory for us, you know, as something that we need to key in on sometimes, because those outside agencies do require consent from the parent and also a notice.
I've seen it both ways too in my experience. I've had cases where the parents didn't want that counsel. They wanted that to be separate and private. I've seen other cases where it was we're all one team. Let's do the best we can for the child. And then the outside agency, the counselor maybe come in and give some behavior modification strategies that the regular education and special education teacher can use that they've been working on in sessions.
Yeah, you alluded to First Steps as well. And that's another time when you need consent from the parent to include First Steps in that first meeting. So that's certainly very super important. So good job.
The LEA representative, the chairperson, ensures that students in the 8th grade or 14 are invited. Written notice is delivered to the parent. All members are notified of the time, place, and date. A copy of the notice is filed in the due process file, and the parent contact is documented. As the ARC chairperson, make sure that the location is clean and inviting, and make sure that it's an area that's private and positive. In the past, we've had some meetings in other districts where it got in a cluttered area and it wasn't real well lit, and that kind of just starts you off in a bad, you know, in a negative light. The LEA representative provides full explanation of procedural safeguards, introduces all the members, states the purpose of the meeting, aligned with the meeting notice, checks and reviews all documentation with the conference summary, and tries to provide an understanding for ARC members. When you determine appropriate membership, like if parents have joint custody, both parents must agree before any decisions are made. So you got to make sure that you see who has, got to check the paperwork for the child, if they're with both parents. If they have joint custody, both parents must agree. If they have, or order of the state, you have to get the caseworker. So you got to make sure and you have to have all of that stapled in your new process folder with your appropriate membership form. So it's always something. That
Ed Rec form too is super important, right? You know, up front to determine who is actually able to make decisions for the student if they can't make them for themselves, if they're not emancipated and such. So yeah, that's perfect because, and then, you know, in the state of Kentucky, I know Jared probably heard this many times, it's rare now that they go away from joint custody. A lot of divorces end in joint custody with children. So we have to, it becomes problematic for an ARC because if it's services, if it's consent, both have to agree, and that's sometimes difficult.
And I've noticed also that if you have
Do you have something, Jerry?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something really quickly if I can, Jerry, if you don't mind. The thing that we see when we look at folders more than anything is people not using the correct guardian, particularly in a guardian ad litem situation. They'll assume that there's someone there who can represent that kid. So just to say, make sure that if you're conducting those, that you have the right person in the room, even if, and I will tell you, this is the one we see the most commonly, if the parent's incarcerated, they still have to participate. And I mean, whether that's a $50 phone call collect to the facility, they're still supposed to be able to participate if they are the guardian or they have custody of a child, or they have to provide input. So I know you're probably going, I may have stolen your thunder there, Jeremy. So, but that's what we see a lot, and probably one of the thing we cite the most when we're looking is making sure that everybody who has the legal rights participates in that ARC, because we see that a lot of times. So
we've had cases too before where the dad has custody and is at work and sends the girlfriend, and the girlfriend can't make decisions, so you have to reschedule the meeting. So that's why it's so important to.
Or Granny shows up.
Simple represent, and then like he's talking about, even the folks, if they're incarcerated, they have the right to be invited.
Yeah.
And unless you exhaust those invitations and they don't respond, then they're supposed to participate.
You still have to invite. You still got to document that they were invited and that you did not get a response.
And your policy and procedure locally will tell you how many invites, and it's always either 2 or 3 paper notices, and then a different form of communication, either a phone call or a text or something. So
when I was doing special education, if they did not respond on the paper notice, I would always call back and say, I'm sending a new notice home. Be on the lookout for it. Sometimes the parents will just call you and say, I got the notice, but I'm not sending it back, but I'll be there. And that's fine. I would just write it on the notice and put it in the due process folder.
Well, and here's the thing. If you don't document it, it doesn't happen. And what we see a lot of times is they'll say, well, we made one attempt. Well, that's not, if your policy and procedure is 2 or 3 times, then we're going to go say you're in violation of your own district policy or procedure where that's concerned. So again, just make sure that you're aware, if you are the ARC chairperson, that you're following those and you're exhausting every I think the way the reg reads is every reasonable effort to make contact. So
I'm at a fairly small school, so we know most of the parents and their situations. But I could understand somebody that's coming into the position that maybe didn't have that knowledge. You got to check that folder. You got to check the student folder and kind of see who's got custody, if there's any court papers.
And while we're talking about this too, and you may have this on in your presentation. If you do, I apologize. But one of the things we see lots of times when students are awarded state, social workers will try to represent. And so you have to be really careful about not allowing that. As far as consent and those types of things, you're supposed to have a surrogate and whatnot. So, if they're, it's key to remember, and I think probably everybody knows this, but if they work for the state, you got a conflict of interest. If they work for the state and then they're also representing the child, it's a conflict of interest. So.
How about the case manager, the child's case manager? That's typically the one that can make the decisions while they're in foster care, correct?
The case manager in foster care?
Yes.
You have to have a surrogate. You have to have a surrogate. As far as giving permission to evaluate, that's what we get into. A lot of times we get the kids, they've been transit, they've moved around a lot, very mobile, and we get them in, and we have to determine, are they eligible? And in order to do that, we've got to get somebody that has the legal right, and we have to determine who that is to give us consent. So that becomes problematic sometimes. And what I'm saying to you is, like, your social worker, your caseworker, your state designated worker cannot sign that consent. So
and that's what I was talking about with guardian ad litem a few minutes ago. It typically you have to have in your list. Your district is supposed to have a list. Notice I say supposed to have a list of eligible surrogates in those cases that you can enlist them as the representative on behalf of the child.
Right.
But typically a caseworker cannot serve unless that's their child, that they're in their care. That's the only, but typically I'd say 99% of the time they can't serve as the legal rep for that kid.
So what if it's one of these, non-state foster systems and they have educational rights? Who do you go with then? Like say it's Sunrise or whatever, that's a foster care, it's independent from the state. So they're not paid by the state, well, they technically, I guess, are paid by the state, but there's not a state, they're not a state employee.
Yeah, it really depends on how they're placed. So if that typically would still have to have a court order, even if they are placed through an outside foster agency. So in that case, there would still have to be a legal document that says this is the guardian for this kid, and therefore, that, like you said, they have the rights to serve as that. Now, if in absence of that, it always goes back to the parent. So the parent, unless there is something that's present,
Right.
that parent, no matter if they're in Timbuktu and in the Western Kentucky Correctional Facility, you still have to go with them, even though but it depends on what the legal document for that child says, and that's what you've always got to look at.
And I mean, some of these foster systems will get a court order saying they can make educational rights for that child. Not all of them do that, which is where you run into a lot of, and I mean, I've only seen one case, and that was years ago, where that was an issue.
If in absence of a legal document that says who that child's right is, it goes back to the parent, always, no matter where they are. And again, that's where you have to make every attempt per your policies and practices to.
And I would add to that, rarely does the state of Kentucky, the court system is very conservative about terminating biological parent rights.
Yeah,
You rarely see that.
Yeah.
So you really have to, when you get into those foster care cases, it's really we got to.
Sometimes you have to
Yeah, I know
find
you want
out if
you have.
parent rights have been terminated.
Yeah.
Because the foster parent doesn't know always.
Yep.
I have a meeting scheduled for Monday, and it's a foster parent situation. They have a court order that says they can make educational decisions, but the parent rights have not been terminated. And so the dad is going to participate via speakerphone at the meeting.
They have a right to be invited and participate. Right, just like Greg said.
Yeah.
So.
Sorry, didn't mean, but I was going to.
Good discussion.
This is one of those areas that it gets kind of hinky.
Yeah.
And we see a lot of times, I don't do the audits anymore, but back when I was doing the audits, that was one of the most common things we would see. So.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Scheduling, begin sending out those notices. I think best practice is at least a month before the ARC is due. This will allow for three meeting notices through various means of contact, letter, phone call, email, or whatever your contact is with the parent. The LEA representative chairperson obtains the required signatures, provides a copy of meeting documents to parents, files the copies in the due process folder, and receives the referrals for special education. In our district, before a student referral is given, we go through a screening process with our MTSS. The director has to go through looks at all of those, that pre-data to see if the referral can proceed forward, or if there's not enough data. They look at attendance, they look at grades, they look at all of their assessments to see if the student, they look at their tiered data to make sure they've been through tier 2 and tier 3 to see if there is a need. But the chairperson, typically it's the principal that receives the referrals for special education services. Would you agree with?
Absolutely agree with that, yes. And it should be looking at that for fidelity. It should be looking for progress data, data points, seeing that those strategies are research-based and have some high leverage practice to them. So the LEA chairperson really has a huge responsibility, because it says also that you, and he hit on it earlier, that you understand and can supervise the provision of specially designed instruction. And that goes a long way in knowing the difference between what's universal design for learning, what's differentiation, and what's MTSS. So you really have to, and I think, and Jared's here with us today, so we can go ahead and just throw this out. I think it goes a long way in proper identification, so we have to really be careful about over-representing. in particular areas of disability category. And we can, as a district, receive some ramifications for that if we're not real careful. So the chairperson's role is key into making sure that the student has had the proper instruction, has had been through the proper tiers, and acts as the gatekeeper, really, in terms of referral acceptance.
Sometimes I'll have a teacher that will come to my office and say, I'm thinking about referring to a student. I'll look at the data, and if I'm a universal screener, they're in the 48th percentile class. I'm like, but this child, you might need to do some intervention in the classroom, but this child's not going to meet the criteria.
That's exactly how it's supposed to work. Yeah. Whether or not we got people doing that a lot, there's lots of variables to play in, but that's certainly the way it's supposed to work here.
And one test for one screener in the 2nd percentile doesn't identify a child. It has to be over time. Mm-hmm. It's not just, everybody could have one bad day or one bad assessment. So it's really important to look at that over time.
What I have found in my short time as a special education teacher, no offense to principals, but they are clueless when it comes to special ed unless they have worked in it. Especially a new principal that's just starting out as principal, that's been a regular ed teacher or, preschool teacher, whatever background they may have come from. And I think that's why a lot of districts are going to, like Denny Paul trains us to be chairpersons in the absence of our principal, who, when we were under a lot of state mandated stuff, he wasn't at school most days. He was either at central office or in a meeting in Lexington with KEA or in a meeting with the state people in our building, and just was not available. But no offense to the principals, that's not their scope of practice before they become principal. So any principal that does know what's going on is either took the time to figure it out or was a special education teacher. So, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, that's a good point. I think your good principals are the ones that's going to study, and they're going to look at those ARC agendas, and they're going to review the law and try to gain an understanding before they show up to a meeting. But that was one of the main reasons that I wanted to do my PAD project on this. I've been in education for 20 years. I've served parent, regular ed, special ed, and chairperson. And a lot of times in the past, the principal would go over the rights, and the special education teacher would do the majority of the talking. And really, it's a partnership.
Well, your background in psychometry really comes into play here. You're talking about percentiles and whatnot. That's being able to look at that data and make a discernible decision on whether or not the kid has made progress. And that's a movable target sometimes. So that's great.
I put in with preschool and participate in the transition conference arranged by First Steps. And just as a reminder to obtain that prior parental permission before the meeting to include First Steps. Even though we're transitioning them from First Steps to our preschool program, you still got to get permission if you're inviting them. Draft documentation, having a draft IEP conference summary that's perfectly fine, because if we wrote it all up over in the meeting, we'd be there for 4 or 5 hours.
Maybe longer if you're like me and don't type very well.
But ensure that all documentation is referred to as a draft version during the meeting. During the meeting, ask parents or guardians open-ended questions that will garner responses such as, what do you think should be included in the IEP goals? What are some specific strengths and weaknesses of the child? What do you notice that they have trouble with at home? What have you noticed they've had trouble with in the past? Have you seen them make progress on A, B, or C? The special education teacher is really the teacher of the child with knowledge about the child's disability. They participate in the development of the IEP. They help implement the IEP. They communicate progress, and they do any program accommodations or modifications. So the special education teacher is supposed to be your expert that can say, looking at your child's full-scale IQ, it was a 64. They say that most typical adults will range in there from 85 to 115, so they consider 100 kind of a baseline number. So that 68 is considered 2 standard deviations behind. They're the person that can explain that to the parent. They have knowledge of the disability. All decisions must be based on data, provide all stakeholders with the data used. So we want to specifically name any tests or assessments given. We want to give the percentiles, the scale scores. We want to give an interpretation of those scores. The regular education teacher, and I thought this was very important, and that's why I highlighted it. The regular education or general education teacher, even though a lot of times in meetings they'll be the one that's the quietest, they are actually the person that knows the child best. They're with them the most of the time. They should be able to provide information to the ARC about the general curriculum for same-aged peers. They also should participate in the development of the IEP. The regular education teacher should be able to step in and say, as a 5th grader, your child should have knowledge of fractions, be able to add and subtract fractions. They should be able to go through the curriculum and tell those baseline markers that a child should be able to do. Then they can also in turn say, this is where your child falls. They're having trouble with this, this, and this. That's an excellent point to create your goal from too. A regular education teacher assists in the determination of instructional strategies that the child will need. Supplementary aids and services, program modifications, or support for school personnel that would be needed. The regular education teacher also implements the IEP. It's not just the special education teacher, but regular education teachers with them most of the time. They have to be able to implement it when the special education teachers spot with them. Regular education teacher questions. What does it? So these are some questions that try to give a regular education teacher before the meeting. They know that we'll ask them this during the meeting. That way they're not caught off guard. What does a typical student look like in the areas of reading, math, writing, and social emotional in general? And remember, there's no such thing as average, so we just use the terms like typical and in general. Can you tell us what are the trouble spots that we can make plans or accommodations for? Can you help bolster an understanding of the student's knowledge of the content? Let the general education teacher know these questions will be asked before the meeting so they can have an answer prepared and not feel like they're put on the spot. Most general education teachers, they know where their kids are and they can tell you what they can do, but sometimes when you put anybody on the spot, you kind of lose focus. So let them know ahead of time these are some questions that you'll be answering during the meeting. The related services providers, remember, they must be invited to the meeting. If the student receives that service, you got to give those related services providers time to work on their part of the IEP. So remember to invite them. Let them know ahead of time, hey, I'm going to schedule an ARC with Denny Paul on this day. Does that work for you?
Yeah.
The related service provider interprets the instructional implications of the evaluation, and they assist with the IEP development. The related service provider should be able to clearly describe how and why the child is eligible for that related service. And they can also explain the adverse effect on the child's education. As an ARC chairperson, you're representing the school and the district. Be genuine, kind, empathetic, and hold a positive regard no matter the circumstances. You're the person you're the face of the district in that meeting. If you're happy and you're trying to be positive, the district looks happy, the district looks positive. If you're negative and you're giving them nothing but bad remarks on their child, or, well, they're doing this and that, and they need to work on it, that's going to come across as a negative. Ensure each member is an active member of the team. Provide parents with a list of acronyms and terminology if they seem confused. If this is an initial or first-time referral, provide this beforehand. Facilitate open dialogue. Always ask parents open-ended questions about what they feel should be in the IEP, and then document their answers in the conference summary. Remember the IEP present levels and make sure that the child is receiving FAPE in their LRE. If there's something that a parent does not completely understand, make sure it's your responsibility to explain it to them. And then this is the ARC process flow chart. This is for MSD students.
Mm-hmm.
So first of all, parent guide provided and the diploma options are discussed and documented. They have to have a copy of that they're supposed to have a copy of that before the meeting, sent home so they can look at it and they can know those options. All 4 participation criteria is required for eligibility is discussed and documented. ARC eligibility determinations documented. Document questions completed, the learner characteristics inventory, and the communication plan. ARC discussion, all 4 criteria met, and all sources of evidence are documented in the conference summary. Remember, document. If it's not documented, it didn't happen.
Yeah, and what Jeremy's talking about here is if the student's on alternate assessment, there's additional documentation that's required in the conference summary. And so we want to include that here because that is part of the ARC chairperson's role, is to make sure that those things are being documented in those particularly really intense, very vital meeting for a student that is not going to receive a diploma. And so we talk about this, and does this have a place in the ARC discussion as a chairperson? Absolutely. So.
Some of those conversations with parents are difficult.
Very difficult.
And you really have to look at your data, and you have to go through the questions one by one and make sure that that's the absolute best path for the child, because there are ramifications in the future, based on your decisions.
Yes.
Well, and I'll throw this in too, if you don't mind.
Go right ahead.
We had a district within KVAC who was really struggling with determining eligibility. And their total numbers went from 36 FMD students, once they started looking at some things, down to 12. And you're talking about a life-changing situation for those kids. So that's why it's so important to make sure that you're having those conversations and letting those folks know this means that your child will not receive that diploma.
Just because the IQ is 52 doesn't mean the child's performing at that level.
Agreed completely, totally, Jeremy. That's the reason I'm glad, and I know this is from our stuff, but
yes.
I'm glad to hear you touch on this specifically, because that communication piece, a lot of folks don't realize until it's too late that their child may not be receiving a diploma.
And there's more ramifications of that not receiving a diploma. In some cases, they may not ever have the right to vote. Cannot have the right to, I went through this, is why I know all this. Can never purchase a firearm, can never get a driver's license. So when we were qualifying these kids FMD, you really have to make a judgment call if the kid is functionally, mentally disabled. Because sometimes you're right, the IQ will be 52, or it could be 51. 52, you could say, I'll use the standard error of measure and make his, because the rest of his scores are around the 55, 58, 59, like his white scores and his violent scores and his test. Any testing that you're doing could be right around just above that mark. And you could use that standard error of measure. But if it's 51, you can't use the standard error of measure. And then you have to really go into your conference summary and justify why this kid is not functionally, although his IQ may show this. And like I said, the only reason I know this, I went through this a couple of years ago. The parent, actually wasn't the parent, it was the guardian, found out all of a sudden, and I mean, this was a new one on me, that if you're an FMD student, you don't get a regular diploma, you can't vote, and not all this is a definite, but the diploma is a definite. But it's not always that you can't vote on a firearm or get a driver's license, but it could be. And she didn't want to take that chance, and I agreed that this kid was not, his IQ was low, but nothing else was really low, other than as far as being an FMD low.
Yes. Well, that's why it's so important to do a complete review of the data and really see, and that triangulation and even beyond, to see, is this kid truly in that situation where they're not functional in some way, shape, form, or fashion. And you talk about the differences outside the education world, I mean, that's those are some huge ramifications, and you're talking about lifetime ramifications. So that's the reason, you know, I was very happy, and Denny Paul helped me with that district in particular. You know, it's really talking about an impact on kids. And Denny Paul knows I about mention this every time I get in a room with people, to say this was a life-changing for that community, not only for that kid, but for the community as a whole.
Yes.
So.
And one of the things too that you can, you know, with students may be in that range, but you really have to look at that use of supplementary aids and services.
Yeah.
Are there things that we can help scaffold that student above that level? And how are they functioning? How are they functioning in society? How are they functioning in the home? How are they functioning in the community? So key, because when they're 1% and they're on alternate track, it should be, even with the use of supplementary aids and services, we still need modifications, and we still need extensive hand-over-hand assistance. And so that's a very small number of your population. So, and the implications, like you said, things that could happen, driver's license, whatnot, but it also, you know, your education piece, being able to be, you know, inclusive and, you know, getting a job, those types of things. So what we try to say to folks is always talk about what might occur rather than the absolute when we're documenting that implication. But that's a great piece there.
The parents' role. The parent should provide input on strengths and needs, interests and preferences. The parent will give consent, evaluation, reevaluation, and for the provision of services. Questions for parents? Some suggested questions for scenarios before, at the end of the meeting, and after the ARC is concluded. One thing that's just really important to make sure you get the relationship with that parent and let them know if they don't understand, speak up and ask. For the meeting, do I know the purpose? Do I know when and where the ARC will meet? Do I know who's supposed to be at the meeting? Will there be transition discussed? Have I seen my child's records? Do I understand what's in the records? How about the goals for my child? Talk with family and friends about it and make a list to take to the meeting. Do I know what my child's interested in? Talk to them and make a list to take to the meeting. Do I know what my child can and can't do at home? If you answer no to any questions, call or visit your child's school or contact the director. At the meeting, ask questions when things are not clear. Do I know how my child will participate in the regular program with children who are not disabled? Parents should state concerns. Speak up if they disagree with something. State the goals that you want for your child. Describe what your child's like at home. Ask the school staff to explain the disability your child has and how it will affect their education. Share a list of goals you think should be included. Annual goals and benchmark goals. At the end of the meeting, do I know what special services my child will get? Do I know how often and the length of the services? Do I know how my child's progress will be measured and reported? The parents understand progress reports, how those work. Do I know when we will review the IEP and the schedule for review? Do I know where educational and related services are provided? Do I know how my child will participate in statewide testing and assessment programs, including what kind of accommodations will they receive to help them, or modifications might they need to help them do their best? If my child is between the ages of 3 and 5, do I know what steps will be taken to make sure there's a smooth transition from preschool to the primary program? If my child's 14 or older, do I know what is in his or her plan for the transition from school to work, additional training or higher education for community living? And do I know my child needs extended school year services to prevent regression? All of those things should be documented, of course, in the conference summary. After the meeting, parents, did I receive a copy of the meeting summary of the IEP? If no, call the school and ask. Did I give written consent for services prior to implementation of the IEP? Am I in agreement with the IEP? Do I want to talk with the committee before the next scheduled meeting, and do I know how to do this? If you answer no to any of the questions, parents should call the child's school. This is a copy of a meeting agenda that we use. We have the agendas for virtually any situation that could come up within a year. I found that sometimes it's best to just put this agenda up on the screen during the meeting. That way the parents or guardian knows what we're doing. Because this isn't like a hidden document. And I think if we're transparent with parents and they know what we're doing, that sometimes just make things better. A lot.
Where do you think that? I've never seen this.
If you'll send me an email, I can send you a copy of our agendas. It's just jeremy.hall@breathitt.
So that's a
So
Breathitt
it's something
County
that
thing.
you made.
That is a creation of the collaboration between the cooperatives or the SERTACs in the state. So we have those available and we can share those with you.
But I have an electronic file copy I can send you if you'll just send me an email.
So that's a good idea. That's a really good idea.
I feel like in education, sometimes we try to hide it. We feel like we're trying to hide things, but there's no reason a parent can't see that and, know this is the process we're going through today. Chairperson tips: be kind, smile, show empathy. Facilitate communication between members. If you see somebody not participating, ask them a question, have them chime in. Choose location positively and inviting. Be transparent, let parents know what you're doing and why. The meeting agendas are not classified materials. Educate yourself on special education eligibility, specially designed instruction, meeting agendas, present levels, etc. Here's are some of the references that I use for my presentation. This was one of my posters that I have that just kind of goes over a brief description of what each of those three members do during the ARC process. Do you have any questions?
Jeremy, I like that you included the additional time for notice, because I think it's so key that we don't wait until the last minute to do an ARC if it's an annual review. But that best practice of having folks on their toes, at least a month before, and maybe even sometimes longer than that, to get folks to the table and include parents. And I appreciate your presentation. It's really good.
I feel like that if you call the parent before you send the notice and say, the annual review is due here, I'm going to go ahead. Is there a day or time that works best for you? And you include them in that. It's better than sometimes they just get a letter home and they're busy, they work.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
Reaching out.
Snail mail is kind of getting outdated a little bit. Mm-hmm. And I've worked with First Step, so I have a lot of really young parents. And
they want
to text them, they want to participate via Facebook, Messenger. So we always do notices that I do that too. I always make a contact, either by phone, and sometimes they'll say, can you text me? So,
And we do have other districts represented, so make sure you check with your director and look at your policies in regards to your communication with parents, because it's very important that we stay within the policy of our district when we do that. But that's a great point as well.
Yeah, I just think we need to look at maybe more of those things with our policies.
Yeah, broaden
because our
that.
parents are getting a little bit more.
It is a new generation.
It is. Yeah. They're different. They don't like to talk. They like to.
I feel like the communication changed for me during COVID because we were trying to have online school the last 3 months of that year. And some of the kids started that way, so they would send me pictures of work and I would send them something back, and I feel like there was more communication via Messenger and just messages than I've ever had with parents in the past. But that was what we needed to get through that situation, so it was okay, but generally I like to.
And before COVID, I wouldn't use Messenger. I just didn't want parents in my personal life, but during COVID, you had to get creative if you needed to have a meeting. You had to just do whatever you could do. So,
that's a good point, Chris. That's a good point. So, certainly, great job with your presentation, and we appreciate all the effort, and we love that background that you have. Jeremy's been a teacher in special education. He's been a parent. He's been a guidance counselor. He is a guidance counselor now. It's been so he has a a vast array of talents that he brings to the table, and we appreciate very much. You've unturned a lot of stones in this presentation, so very good job. And
I really enjoyed working to it. And,
Jerry, do you have any final comments?
No.
Good. You guys ready to have Tracy?
Just happy to be here. Yeah, this is great.